Hello and welcome to the NDTV Dialogues, and this is the Thinkers series. Who better to have on it than Amitav Ghosh? He's of course a well-known author, but he's so much more than that. As Foreign Policy said in 2019, he's one of the most influential global thinkers of the last decade. He's also the winner of the Gyanpith Award and the Erasmus Prize for his writings on the planetary crisis and climate change. Thank you so much for being on the Dialogues, Mr. Ghosh.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you very much for having me.
It's almost eerie that as we talk, much of what you write about is playing out in real time in California, and we see what's happening with the wildfires. It's of course being reported internationally because the people involved are Hollywood celebrities. But we're seeing versions of this playing out around the world, but somehow we look at these as isolated events. What do you see these as?
Well, the California case is a really interesting one because it was actually completely predictable that it would happen. Because California, it's in a kind of geographical zone where it's bound to have catastrophes because it has exactly that kind of climate. It's in a desert. Now, you know, the problem with Los Angeles in particular is that all its water comes from very distant sources, you know, and there's a lot of sort of institutional corruption built into it. A couple of billionaires have diverted a lot of the water to their farms, you know, where they use this water. I mean, they use just as much water as Los Angeles. You know, it's a kind of really shocking thing. So what you'll see really in all these disasters that are playing out across the planet is that climate change is an intensifier. But also, you can't understand any of them without understanding the localism of it. Because this is the weird thing about climate change. You know, it's a global phenomenon that manifests locally. So in every instance, you have to be able to understand, you know, how climate change is interacting with local patterns of settlement, with local patterns of development. So if you just take the case of Chennai, for example, which has had these rain bomb events repeatedly, the problem there is that they've built over an entire floodplain, you know. Similarly, you know, we have these very unsustainable patterns of urban development around Mumbai. And the same is true of Los Angeles. They should not be building, you know, along these mountains where it's known that fires will happen. And they've happened repeatedly over the years, you know. This one is a particularly dramatic one. But, you know, way back in the 1990s, there's a wonderful book called Ecology of Fear by a great writer called Mike Davis. And Mike Davis, you know, in the 1990s, he was charting, you know, the fires, the other disasters, you know, hundreds of thousands of people leaving Los Angeles.
But where do you see, because in that sense, the world as we head into 2025, we've got a new American president taking over, President Trump, who has been a climate change denier. We've seen what happened recently in the COP24 conference, where you saw the richer nations now actually balking, in a sense, going back on promises of climate financing. Where do you see us going, as it seems to be becoming less of a priority for governments and more of a priority for the people impacted by it?
You know, the interesting thing about President Trump, or I should say President-elect Trump, since there's still another a few days left before he's inaugurated. The interesting thing about him is that he's not entirely a climate denier. In 2009, he actually signed this petition asking the US government to act on climate change because, you know, he has properties all around the world which are now actually threatened by climate impacts. So at some point, he made a very political decision to deny climate change, you know. And it's actually become a part of a culture war. You know, so the right, basically, they just say there's no such thing as climate change. It's just natural variability, which it absolutely is not. I mean, we can see that it's anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions that are driving these impacts. But what does it mean when someone like that, or when the right wing in the Western world say that there's no such thing as climate change?
Because the US could pull out of the Paris Agreement.
It's very likely. They did pull out once, and it's completely possible that they'll do it again. What is the thinking behind that, you know? And the thinking behind that is that climate change will mainly affect poor countries, poor people, and that wealthy countries will be okay. But this is a complete fantasy. I mean, what we see today in California, these are some of the richest people in the world, richest, most famous. Wealth or just affluence as such is not going to protect them. Again, we see, during the COVID crisis, I think the COVID crisis is a forerunner of the planetary crisis, So the COVID pandemic, it didn't play out at all according to affluence or wealth or whatever. Two of the countries that were worst affected were the UK and the USA, So wealth is not actually going to protect people from the impacts of the planetary crisis.
An interesting point to make in your latest collection of essays, Wild Fictions, is of course the point that in the perception of climate change and the variation between the global north, the richer countries in the west, and the global south, there are also historical reasons. There's also a question of disparities of power. There's a geopolitical clash happening. How is that linking with what we're currently seeing with the geopolitical upheaval, which of course with the power centers moving from the west, as it were, to Asia, to China, to India, and the global south?
Well, as the Greek philosopher Heraclitus once said, war is the father of all things. And that's exactly what we are seeing playing out in front of us, Essentially, geopolitics trumps everything else, That's the clear message that we are seeing. At the same time, as in the COP meetings, the Western world is saying, oh, we don't have any money, but they're upping their spending on defense expenditure year by year. Germany is now it's sort of tripled or something, its defense expenditure, and we see this across the planet, So it's very clear where the priorities, especially of the Western world, where the priorities are. They are already responsible for 75% of the world's defense spending, and they're continuously upping the ante. So most of all, what they really want to do, it's perfectly clear, is to maintain the hegemonic grip that the West has had on the world for the last 300 years. That is really their project. And, they may, mouth some pieties about climate change and so on. But that's not their priority at all.
So where do you see the real changes coming from? We're seeing, of course, in the global south, the point you've made about aspirations. And as we sit, of course, in Delhi, where headlines will say the air has improved to very poor. We're in the middle of Delhi elections, but no political party, and frankly, not even voters seem to care about the fact at all that Delhi is the world's most polluted city.
It's an astonishing thing. What has actually happened is that, if you go anywhere, if you're in the global north and you ask people what is climate change, they'll tell you it's a sort of techno-scientific thing. It can be fixed through technological fixes of various kinds. If you go anywhere in the global south and ask people and you say to them, you're threatened just like anybody else, don't you think you should shrink your carbon footprint? What will their answer be? Their answer is always, why us? They should shrink their carbon footprint because for years when we were weak and poor, they expanded their carbon footprint enormously. So now it's our turn. So already there you see the perception of climate change in the global south is a geopolitical one. It's one about global injustice. It's one about equality. And that's why I think, within certainly the political classes, whether it be India or Indonesia or China or wherever, there is an absolute determination that, we will never again allow ourselves to be as weak and as poor as we were in the past, during colonialism. Because in fact, it was colonialism that in some very profound way created this problem. This problem of this enormous disparity of lifestyles, of consumption, of carbon footprints. So this is the problem really, that we see that the geopolitical issue has really overtaken every other issue, so to speak.
Because of course, is there space, do you think, for almost a global south led model of development, because we've seen that at least what's happening in countries like India and Bangladesh, etc. Climate change is also very much a livelihood issue. If you're talking to farmers, if you're talking about crop patterns, if you're talking about the daily impact on people's lives, it is completely a livelihood issue. If, for instance, apples come much later, or the glaciers aren't melting in time, the rain will fail. So it seems to have become very much a livelihood issue here as well. Is there a model of another kind of development you think the global south could adopt rather than following the Western way?
This is one of the weird things that's happened. If we think back to 100 years ago, Mahatma Gandhi was able to say that, we don't want to develop in the way that the Western world has developed, because if we do, we'll consume the world like locusts. But this is one of the really remarkable things that's happened since then. Nobody anywhere in the world will now say this. In fact, there is no longer a global south model, in dealing with these issues. We've all now accepted this kind of Washington consensus, this neoliberal model. Everyone only talks about growth, growth, growth. Can you think of any politician in any country in the global south who would say that we would voluntarily not choose growth? There are a couple of examples, Bhutan, Costa Rica, but they're by far the outliers. So we've all now been literally colonized by this model of growth. And it's this model of growth that is taking us towards disaster.
What do you think the geopolitical power shift, what do you think that would mean for the world? Because just in terms of, I think, the inevitability of, say, the rise of China, the new axes being formed with China and Russia, the emerging role of India, the most populous country in the world currently, what do you see as the impact of that being beyond the military?
This is a seismic shift. It's a seismic shift in the balance of power around the world. And I must say that for me, I mean, it's in some way really an incredibly exciting moment, in a sense, that finally there is a shift away in global power from the West, which has monopolized this for 300 years. Finally, there's a shift away from it. And it's interesting, it's happened 60 years after decolonization. It's taken that long. I mean, things don't happen overnight. I mean, decolonization doesn't happen just by signing a few documents. It takes a long, long time. So this enormous expansion that we see in the economies of the global south has really happened only really in the last 10, 15, 20 years. But I think it's enormously interesting in a way. Certainly, I think it's a very necessary shift. But what's also perfectly clear is that the West is not going to, the status quo powers, who are the powers in the West, are not going to accept this changed reality very easily. They're going to fight it tooth and nail. And that's what they're doing. We can't forget that the West did everything it could to undermine the Bandung Conference, for example. Yet, at that point, the non-aligned nations did manage to hold this conference. It was really a major inflection point. And I'm sure that they have now still enormous resources. So they will try to undermine this process in whatever way they can. But I think this change has achieved what you might call a sort of escape velocity. It's going to happen.
And of course, the other thing which has achieved escape velocity is technology. And you talk also in your essay on migration about how digital technology and what the implications of that are as levers of migration. Also now we talk about artificial intelligence. Every day we see that it seems to be becoming more powerful. You have a tech czar, in a sense, very close to the president, will be a great influence on the new administration. How do you see technology playing out with many of the age-old issues that you've been raising of empire, colonialism, inequality and disparities of power?
See, as I've argued in my article on my essay on migration, I first began to sort of observe this whole phenomenon of migration. I mean, I've spent my whole life traveling, so it's something that interests me. But when the so-called European migration crisis started around about 2012, 2013, 2014, I became very interested in it. So I went off actually to Italy, where I interviewed a lot of the migrants who are from South Asia. overwhelmingly Bangladeshis, but lots of Pakistanis also. Relatively few Indians. And the Indians who are part of that sort of migratory trend are almost all from Punjab, So pre-existing networks make a huge difference. And Punjab has those pre-existing networks. Bangladeshis have even greater networks like that. But what is absolutely crucial to these movements is actually communications technology, cell phone technology. That entire movement depends entirely on the cell phone. It's through the cell phone that migrants pay the dalals. It's through the cell phones that they find out where exactly they're going. They can change their destination literally, within minutes, So this has now become one of the world's, actually I think it's the world's largest clandestine industry. It's actually taken over drugs. But, let's not make any sort of bones about it. The whole pattern of shifting populations around the world, of making these demographic interventions, began with imperialism. It's with the colonization of the Americas that Europeans embark on really this incredibly cruel demographic intervention where they really literally wipe out the populations of the Americas, the indigenous populations, and then replace them, with European populations and Africans who were taken there as enslaved workers. That's the largest demographic intervention the world has ever seen. Similarly, the export of indentured workers from India, which replaced slavery. Again, that's done entirely under state control, under British government control, What has completely changed, and it's really technology that has enabled this change, is that today the Western powers are no longer in control of this flow of movement. And there's a kind of mythology that's grown up around it, which is that if you build walls, it'll stop people. No, it won't. For these young kids, danger is an incentive. It's what makes them go. You think of those couples, the stories we read about all the time about these Gujarati families freezing to death on the Canadian border. Their families with young children, and their families who had perfectly good lives back in Gujarat. So this is not explicable by any sort of economistic measure. There's something else, something completely different at work here.
So when we see technology as a great disruptor, do you think it would be a disruptor for good? Why is it that would be developing, say, a relatively new technology, if you look back at history now, that we are not factoring in elements of how to improve, whether it's on metrics like climate, whether it's on metrics like equality, gender equality. And in fact, it seems to be becoming a vehicle which just propagates our worst prejudices.
Yes, I'm sure. We all know that. We can see with social media. Social media is incredibly powerful, incredibly disruptive, incredibly dangerous. All the founders of the big social media platforms don't allow their children to use it, because they know how dangerous it is. All the cyberbullying, all the horrible stuff that happens. So yeah, as with other great sort of technological changes, the print culture introduced in the 16th century basically was also enormously disruptive. It played a major part in leading to the Protestant Reformation, So all these great disruptions actually percolate through society in slowly and in very disruptive ways. I think we haven't even begun to see the end of it.
You've written so much in your work of really the planet and looking at a more vitalistic narrative, looking at the other species on this planet. How do you see that playing out? You've got, of course, Elon Musk talking about interplanetary species and exploring Mars. How do you see this narrative? How do you see this actually playing out at a time when, as you said, there's geopolitical upheaval, there's technology really creating a new way of communications with each other, disrupting the world as we knew it? How do you see actually looking at a more vitalistic narrative?
Look, with Elon Musk and all the others who want to colonize Mars, you can see that really what they're trying to do is to live out a fantasy of colonization. You know, they've inherited this project where they've always dreamt of, colonizing the American West, colonizing Australia, colonizing all these places. And now, yeah, exactly. And now that those places are already accounted for, the only places that are left are these planets like Mars and so on. Let's face it, it's never going to happen. We all know that. I mean, Mars may, under extreme engineering circumstances, support a few thousand people, or even a space station may support a few hundred or a few thousand, but it's never going to become a place that humanity can escape to. One of the weird things about these great tech billionaires is that obviously they grew up reading a lot of science fiction. I grew up reading a lot of science fiction, and a lot of science fiction is about Mars, colonizing Mars, and so on. But when you read it, it's a fantasy. But it's the fantasy that they live in, So that fantasy makes them despise the actual Earth that they live in. No matter how much you may colonize Mars, it will never be a planet as beautiful as this. As beautiful, as filled with meaning, as filled with joy, as the planet that we are already in. So there's a kind of tragedy about this, Really, the reason why they want to escape to Mars is because they see no more meaning in our planet. Our planet for them is exhausted not just of resources, but most of all, it's exhausted of meaning. It has no hold on their imagination anymore. And I think this is the saddest part of this technoscientific sort of myth-making, It can't see any value in everything that is the most valuable in this world that we live in.
No, and in fact, you made an interesting point also that even the word colonization, that how in large areas in the West, that it's actually now being seen as it's being whitewashed in a sense, that colonization was actually a good thing, that look at what it brought, look at the benefits it brought, and that those should be recognized now. How would you combat that?
Well, I don't need to. My college mate, Shashi Tharoor, has done that really, really well. We know that, in fact, whatever it brought, colonization introduced in the worst possible ways. But just to take this question of colonization, one very important aspect of colonization is what you might call terraforming, which is what Elon Musk wants to do to Mars. But you look at what's happening in California, it's a perfect example of terraforming. They literally engineered the landscape of California to be something that it was not. And now what's happening, and we see this across the world, is that these landscapes that were terraformed under colonization are now coming apart. This is happening in California, it's happening in Southeast Australia, it's happening in many other places, It's happening across the Midwest. All the damming projects are now coming undone. They're having to sort of destroy the dams, because the dams have created such mayhem and havoc. So, this is the extraordinary thing. They think that they can go to Mars and colonize Mars and terraform Mars. Whereas right here on Earth, we can see these great terraforming projects literally coming undone in front of our eyes. I mean, that's really what's behind this catastrophe that we see unfolding in California.
You refer also in the book to the age of monsters. But do you find that you get trapped sometimes in this whole argument, which is kind of bipolar, that if you're talking about climate change, you're anti-development, and this is an argument which is, whether it's not just in the global South or India, but it's happening now in the West as well, that you're either this side or that side, and that perhaps is going to be one of the biggest challenges as we go ahead.
Well, first of all, as I see it in the West, I mean, certainly those people who are talking about climate solutions don't see it as a zero-sum game. I mean, they think that alternative energy can actually substitute completely for fossil fuels, and it'll more or less allow them to live as they were. I honestly don't see that that can work, because even alternative energy depends on all kinds of extractive industries. Whether it's even sustainable or not, we don't know. I mean, to build one one wind tower, you have, just look at the amount of concrete that goes into it. Look at the amount of steel that it needs, So I don't see these as solutions in any sense. I think we need to think about completely different modes of life. But I don't see that happening at all. I don't see that happening anywhere. So, I think we are just, hurtling towards an abyss. And instead of slowing down, we are accelerating.
So if you had to write, finally, a manifesto for the future, or even a manifesto for 2025, what would be, for you, the top 3 things which you think need to be actionable now?
I don't really think in policy terms like that, because I'm not a policy person. I mean, I'm basically a writer. I think if you ask me, for me as a writer, what's really important is that I have to try and think of how actually we restore meaning to the earth that we live on. And as I've said in these essays as well as in other books, I think the main challenge that we now face is how to give voice to the non-human. How to conceive of our relationships with non-human entities of every kind, whether it be trees or animals or landscapes or mountains. And over there, I think what we need most of all is to learn from indigenous peoples around the world, from Adivasis. We have to learn, why Niyamgiri is sacred, to the Kons who live around there, And I think that is the kind of answer that I'm looking for. I'm not looking for technological answers, because I don't think there are any.
Amitav Ghosh, thank you so much for being on the Dialogues.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.